the course of over the course of American history. Initially, that is for the first, I'm going to say, at least 70 years of American political history, that is, say, the history of the United States of America, we had a system that many political scientists referred to as dual federalism. And this was maintained until the Depression in the 1930s. And the idea behind dual federalism is that, and there's going to be a graphic of this, is that basically there's the states, there's the federal government, and they are basically two separate entities that don't have much relationship in terms of the governance of the country. And this is, on the left you can see what's also called a layer cake model, another phrase for dual federalism. The idea that the state governments have certain powers, the national government has certain powers, and there's very little interaction between them. And this is more or less a reasonable characterization of the way federalism worked until the 1930s. And when we'll talk about how and why this is, but political scientists have argued that I'm not too keen on the term cooperative federalism, but a marble cake federalism, the idea that this layer cake approach to the federal system was gradually and sometimes more swiftly replaced by a much more complicated set of relationships between the national government and state governments. Sometimes cooperation, sometimes conflict, sometimes negotiation and bargaining. All of these suggest that depending on the time period, depending on party affiliation, depending on the issue involved, that intergovernmental relations, that is those between state and federal government, can change. So why did this happen? Why was there a fundamental transformation in American federalism? Why was there an increase in governmental powers? Why was there a new set of relationships that developed over time between the federal government and state governments? And there are a lot of reasons for this. I suppose the simple one is, the simple way to put it is, the United States in 1791 didn't look anything like it did in 1931 or 2001, and in many ways. But that's just kind of a general claim, and let me give you some specifics. Put some meat on that skeleton. First, the South, in theory, lost the Civil War. Slavery was abolished as a consequence of the 13th Amendment. 15th Amendment reasserted or emphasized the power of the national government over state governments, and that state governments could not violate the rights of citizens of the United States of America in violation of national laws and the Constitution. The 15th Amendment provided for equal protection of the laws. Obviously, if you've got population that is, some of which is enslaved and the other which is not, that's not equal protection. Voting rights could not be violated. That's also established by the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment and the 14th Amendment begin a very slow process, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about the judiciary, of what's called incorporation. This is a very important concept. We spoke in an earlier class about how the Bill of Rights initially was applied solely to the federal government to limit its powers, but not to state governments. What the Civil War amendments 13, 14, and 15 did, among other things, was to initiate a process of incorporation, and this is defined as a slow evolutionary application of the Bill of Rights to state and local governments. In other words, the Bill of Rights began to be applied by the courts to state and local governments. You can't do this, just like the federal government can't do X, Y, or Z. State governments can't do X, Y, or Z. This was not something done all at once. This is something done over more than 100 years, frankly. Secondly, so what these amendments did in the aftermath of the Civil War did was to enhance the power of the national government vis-a-vis state governments. Another transformation is in the geography and population of the United States. Huge population explosion. We now have over 310 million people. A good chunk of that is as a consequence of immigration, including, I might add, my grandparents on both my mother's and father's side. So, and probably it's the same for you as well. So the land mass of the United States grew dramatically as more states were entered the Union, and the population did as well. Beginning in the very early part of the 20th century, for the first time, a majority of Americans lived in cities. And this was in large measure a consequence of the growth of industrialism or industrial society, manufacturing jobs, manufacturing businesses, and so on. And so instead of the United States being a small, rural, being dominated by small towns and rural areas where population was rather was not dense at all, as population grew, as the industrial society developed, cities did as well, and so population density is an important factor in the growth of not only the country, but is a major theme in 20th century America. World wars are important. We're important in the United States, not only becoming a superpower, but let me say this. After World War I, the United States was still a little uneasy, somewhat uneasy about becoming too involved in the international affairs of the world. Keep in mind that President Washington warned against entangling alliances. World War II changed a lot. In the aftermath of World War II, not only was the United States fully engaged in terms of foreign policy, but and helped rebuild Europe, but also the end of World War II was a kind of precursor to the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. Nothing in politics, in my judgment, centralizes governmental and political power more than war. You may, and what I mean by that very simply is that national defense, national security is most obviously a national government power. There is no local government, there is no state government in the United States that has nuclear weapons. There is no local or state government that has many of the weapons of the U.S. military, though clearly in recent years a few trickled down, and that's probably really unfortunate as a consequence of congressional action. We really don't need tanks in the streets when at least local or state tanks in the streets when the President of the United States can nationalize the the National Guard and send them in. But war and national defense is a critical. I mean, if you just look at the amount of defense spending as a percentage of overall national spending, national government spending, if you look at the number of people employed, the number of personnel in local and state governments against federal government, against federal personnel numbers, you'll see that there are empirical measures of the very great significance of national defense in terms of enhancing the power of the federal government. The Great Depression was a very critical moment, not just for the world, in a situation where the world economy basically collapsed, but it did in the United States as well. Nationally, we had about 25% unemployed. The Great Depression was so significant that my brother-in-law, when he was 8 and 9 years old, used to wander into his parents' bedroom in the middle of the night and say, "Hey, Ma, tell me about the Great Depression." So if it was meaningful to an 8-year-old in around 1960, you better believe it was very important, and in terms of defining some of the problems in the 1930s that the American people faced. And so the question is, when the economy, put simply, the question was this: when the nation's economy collapses, when millions and millions and millions of people are unemployed, when people start jumping out of buildings to their death, when desperation is high, does the federal government have any responsibility to do something about it? Up until the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s, basically we didn't act as though that was really a cause for federal action. FDR's administration and the New Deal in the 1930s took a different tack. Many still, at that time, still argued that the states could handle this, but in fact they couldn't. One of the reasons that the powers of the national government increased during the 20th century is that states had very odd systems of representation. Not only could most African Americans not vote, especially in the southern states, but there was a situation referred to in the judicial arena as malapportionment. Malapportionment was not a person. Malapportionment was a condition that many state legislatures were characterized by. Simply, we've already talked about how the population of the United States increased dramatically over the course of our history. But many state governments didn't bother to create new legislative districts in ways that made the population in those districts relatively equal. So malapportionment became especially important in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s in the 20th century, because trees and cows often had as much political power as people. So there was no one person, one vote, because the districts were never redrawn to reflect where people in the states lived. This was not true for all states, but it was true for a great many states. So what's the significance of that in terms of the federal system? The significance is this, and we'll talk about this probably more next time. If your state government doesn't represent you, if urban areas where there are many, 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 many people are underrepresented in dramatic ways compared to those who live in rural areas, the legislators from the rural areas are not going to be particularly responsive to the problems and issues and needs in the growing urban areas. Why? Because it doesn't affect their election. So what happens in cases of malapportionment in 20th century American political history? If people can't get some kind of response to their needs, if people in the states couldn't get some kind of governmental action from state governments because they weren't adequately represented, where do you turn? Well, the simple answer is the national government. So for much of the 20th century, and there are those who may disagree with me on this, but I think I'm right. For much of the 20th century, state governments were not keeping up with the needs of the American people in many instances. And in large part, this is because of the nature of their representative systems, or their lack of representative systems. And so one of the reasons, bottom line, for the growth in federal government powers is states didn't do anything. States didn't address issues. Another important feature in the transformation of American federalism is the broadening of democracy. Shortly after World War I in 1921, I believe the constitutional amendment was passed that enabled women the right to vote. There were few states in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century that gave women political rights. Most did not, and it was certainly not in the Constitution anywhere, nor in common everyday political practice. So when women get the right to vote, some decades later, African Americans obtained the right to vote in real terms. They had it in theory, but not in practice. All of a sudden, the electorate expands dramatically in the 20th century. Women can now vote. Minorities can now vote. Immigrants are flooding our shores. And many, many millions become citizens. And so there's a tremendous broadening of political and civil rights over the course of 20th century America. And so what does that mean? Practically what it means is not just a larger number of voters, it means a dramatic increase in the number of demands placed on government by American citizens, and a greater need for addressing issues of broad concern, public concern, needs that the people have. And that helps explain the growth of powers of the federal government in the 20th century. Capitalism and its consequences, and what economists would call negative externalities, is a factor as well. Think, for example, about the major industry for most of 20th century America, automobiles. At the beginning of the 20th century, almost nobody had an automobile. By the end of the 20th century, almost everybody had at least one, if not more. Where, pray tell, are they going to drive if there's no roads? So what happens when all of a sudden we become a car culture? Well, one of the major actions of the federal government in 1956, I believe, it might be 4, but I think it's 1956, was the passage of legislation by Congress, and President Eisenhower signed it, to create the interstate highway system. Obviously, that was a huge undertaking by the federal government, sometimes in collaboration with state governments, and there are various consequences. All of a sudden, we could drive more places more quickly. We could develop suburbs because now the land on the periphery of cities became more accessible. It also created more pollution. So this is just one example of how the economy can lead to consequences that require governmental action. Another very obvious example that state and local governments deal with, federal government as well, is what is known as brownfields. What happens when manufacturing industries pollute? What happens when when the pollution enters year after year after year, decade after decade, the soil? You get brownfields, you get contamination. Is it going to sit there? If it's going to sit there, it's really not too safe for people, especially for kids. So it isn't going to be developed because it's unsafe. So governments have seen the need to clean up brownfields and have developed various programs in order to clean up brownfields so that the land can be used again. Finally, and this goes back to the issue of representation, if state governments in the 20th century weren't too representative, and if that resulted in fewer demands being placed by American citizens, by state residents on state governments, then they wouldn't need to do very much. State governments, if there are few demands and misrepresentation and unequal representation, then state governments don't need to do very much, and yet at the very same time, our country was growing rapidly, both in an economic sense and in a population sense and in a geographic sense. So state governments, for much of the history of 20th century America, had very limited fiscal capacities and powers. They weren't interested in raising lots of money, spending on public projects and services, and so on. And so they didn't. And yet, as needs expanded, people turned to the federal government to get some kind of response. Comments at this point? Okay, so I'm going to go over this kind of quickly. This transformation really occurs in the constitutionally, in terms of jurisprudence, begins to develop meaningfully in the 1930s under the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, and it continued for the most part uninterrupted through the end of the 1960s. So that change, we moved from dual federalism, where state and local governments didn't really interact much, to a marble cake federalism. And one mechanism, one measure of this new kind of federalism was the expansion of federal grant and aid programs by which Congress provided monies to state and local governments to deal with a variety of national but also state problems. And initially, while these programs were funded by the federal government, they were often administered by state and local government officials, and that's still often the case. So this is a chart that shows you the significant increase in the percentage of state and local revenues supplied by the federal government. by 1930, it was still, maybe 2 to 3% of all state and local revenues came from the federal government. By 2010, it exceeded 20%. So that's a huge increase, both in real dollar terms and in percentage. It's more than a six-fold increase in 80 years. And so you can see it's a pretty dramatic and steady increase, with the exception of the 1980s, when President Reagan was in office, and one of his priorities was to reduce not the amount of federal spending, but the amount that was the federal government sent to state and local governments. So this is one measure of how the federal government not only did more over the course of, say, an 80 or 90 year period, but also how it helped the state governments and local governments do more in part because of their limited fiscal capabilities. I wanted to show you this chart. This is about a 20-year chart, a map rather, because the money that the federal government distributes to state and local governments is not the same from one state to another. And so what this map shows is that some states get more than what they give. So the red and orange and peach-colored states over this 20-year period, 1990 to 2009, actually, for every dollar in federal tax that was paid in those states, they actually got more back. So New Mexico, Mississippi, West Virginia, Puerto Rico, Montana, North Dakota, and then all of the peachy states actually got more money back from the federal government in terms of per, if for $1 that a taxpayer in, say, Indiana gave to the federal government, the state over a 20-year period actually received a little bit more. And the darker the shade, the more the state received from the federal government. On the other hand, the green states are those where they paid more federal tax than they got back. So Minnesota, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, Delaware were those that are the darkest green actually paid more in federal tax than they received from the federal government over a 20-year period. We're out of time, and we will wrap up federalism next time. If you have any questions, I'll stick around for a second. And have a good day. Lacey, thank you.
No problem. I sent you emails with instructions on how to add pictures on the fly like I did, as well as how to insert them in your PowerPoint.
Okay, I know how to do. I just
okay.
At 6:20, I just, wow, maybe this would be a good idea. I like to show images. I think they help students. Oh,
I agree, definitely.
And as I proceed, I'll try to do that. And I'll send them an email, or I'll just post an announcement, like I said, regarding those visual resources. You're not going to be here tomorrow?
That is correct.
All right. I'm sorry, I forgot to. I tend to forget to do